The dust of the high plains, an ever-present companion, settled on Abigail's soul much like it did on the weathered, silvered planks of her porch. It was a fine, pervasive grit, finer than milled flour, carrying the scent of crushed sage and sun-baked earth, a scent underscored by the faint metallic tang of a profound loneliness that had etched itself into the lines around her eyes. Elias had been gone 3 long years, spirited away by a malignant fever that had swept through Redemption Gap with the same merciless, consuming indifference as a prairie fire devouring dry grassland. He'd left her the small homestead, 2 rooms, a lean-to, and an ornery patch of land that yielded more rocks than crops. A sturdy Winchester rifle that had been his father's, and a legacy of quiet, unwavering decency that seemed increasingly tragically out of place in a town that appeared to be systematically dismantling its moral compass board by rotten-board Redemption Gap. The name itself was a cruel, biting jest. Abigail often thought a sardonic commentary she'd shared only with the fading image of Elias in her mind. She'd watched the comings and goings from her vantage point, a small rise just outside the town's hurried, often secretive grasp. It was a place of hard men with harder eyes, their faces maps of past deprivations and future ambitions, and even harder bargains struck in hushed tones over lukewarm whiskey in the dim confines of the Dry Gulch Saloon. Piety was a garment donned for Sunday service at Reverend Matthew's sparsely attended chapel, then summarily shed and forgotten by Monday morning, when the real business of the town resumed. Sheriff Brody, a man whose infrequent smile never quite reached his eyes of faded denim blue, eyes that always seemed to be assessing, calculating, kept a version of order that conveniently suited the town's more influential figures. Men like Jedediah Croft, the unctuous proprietor of the general store whose overflowing ledgers Abigail had long suspected, held more damning secrets between their ruled lines than marketable goods on his shelves. Croft's hands, always busy, always seemingly counting, looked as though they were stained with something far less innocent than spilled ink. He was a spider at the center of a grubby web, and Brody, she figured, was one of his most loyal, if well-compensated flies. Abigail had always been an observer, a trait Elias had both admired and occasionally been perplexed by. "You see the marrow in the bones, Abby," he used to say, shaking his head with a wry smile. "The things most folks just stumble over." Lately, the things she'd been seeing had knotted her stomach with a cold, persistent dread. Strangers, rough-looking men with sun-scorched faces and weapons worn with an unsettling familiarity, passing through Redemption Gap with too much quiet purpose and far too little casual explanation. They didn't linger for idle chat. They met with Croft or Brody, their heads bent close in whispered conferences in the dusty street or the back room of the store. Conversations that ceased abruptly, heads snapping up if she or any other uninvolved townsperson drew near. And then there were the unsettling disappearances shadows on the edge of the community native families. Apache, mostly with a few Ute and Paiute bands, who had lived on the fringes of the territory for generations, their camps ephemeral, but their presence a constant, had been vanishing. Without a trace, their abandoned wiki-ups and hastily deserted campsites swallowed by the unforgiving land as if they'd never been. The official explanation, when anyone bothered to ask, which few did, was always vague, dismissive. Migrating further west. Sheriff Brody would say with a shrug, or harsh winter thinned him out. Reverend Matthews, a man whose faith seemed to have eroded under the relentless sun of redemption. Gap would only offer platitudes about God's mysterious ways, but Abigail, who had sometimes traded small goods with these families, who had seen the fear in their eyes long before they vanished, felt a cold knot of horror that had nothing to do with the changing seasons. It was the town she felt holding its breath collectively, guarding a festering secret that pulsed like a diseased heart beneath the mundane surface of daily life. A secret some clearly profited from. Her own life was a carefully constructed bulwark of routine against the encroaching tide of this disquiet. Tending her small, defiant garden, coaxing reluctant vegetables from the parched soil, mending Elias's old woolen shirts until they were more patched than original fabric, each stitch a small act of remembrance. Reading the worn, leather-bound Bible he'd cherished its pages, softened by his touch, seeking solace in verses that spoke of justice and compassion. Commodities in short supply and redemption gap. She kept to herself, not out of bitterness born from her loss, but because the town, with its sidelong glances and sudden silences, seemed to prefer it that way. A widow self-sufficient with eyes that saw too much, and a tongue unwilling to partake in the honeyed poison of local gossip or bend to the prevailing winds of veiled intimidation, was an anomaly. And Redemption Gap, she knew, didn't suffer anomalies gladly. It preferred its women either meekly dependent or brazenly compliant. Abigail was neither. The storm, when it finally broke, came on an evening when the sky was the color of a fresh, angry bruise, deepening from purple to a malevolent black. It had been brewing all day, the air thick, heavy, and unnervingly still, the silence of the prairie punctuated only by the frantic, high-pitched chirping of crickets sensing the atmospheric upheaval. Abigail had been out securing the rattling shutters on her small cabin, and the wind a precursor to the tempest, whipping her graying hair across her face, carrying the scent of ozone and the taste of rain, before it actually fell. The first drops were fat and cold, splattering against the dry, cracked earth with an almost violent percussive hiss. Then, as if a celestial dam had burst, the heavens opened. A deluge, a roaring torrent that turned the familiar world into a gray, churning chaos, visibility reduced to mere feet. She hurried inside her skirt, already soaked, and threw the heavy bolt on the door against the storm's mounting fury. The sound of the wind was a banshee's keen, a mournful, disembodied spirit howling across the plains, seeming to claw at the very foundations of her small home. She lit the kerosene lamp, its gentle, steady glow pushing back the encroaching shadows that danced like grotesque specters in the corners of the room. She stirred the dying embers in the hearth, coaxing them back to life. With dry kindling, the promise of warmth, a small comfort. It was on nights like this, when the elements raged with such untamed ferocity, that she missed Elias most acutely. His solid, reassuring presence had always been a bulwark against the wildness of the world. His calm voice a counterpoint to the storm's roar. Now there was only the wind and her own quiet courage. A sudden, desperate banging on the door ripped through the howl of the storm so sharp and unexpected it made her jump. It wasn't the confident, familiar knock of a neighbor. Few ventured out on such a night, and fewer still sought her company. Nor was it the heavy, authoritative fist of Sheriff Brody or his men. This was frantic, weak, almost despairing, a sound of pure, unadulterated desperation that spoke of an endurance stretched to its absolute limit. Abigail froze her heart, lurching into her throat, a cold premonition snaking through her. She reached for the heavy iron poker resting beside the fireplace, her knuckles white as she gripped its familiar length. "Who's there?" She called out, her voice surprisingly steady, cutting through the storm's relentless roar. Only a renewed, weaker flurry of knocks, punctuated by what sounded like a choked sob, almost lost in the wind. Taking a deep, steadying breath, a prayer forming silently on her lips, she unbolted the door and pulled it open. Just a crack. The wind tore at it, with savage strength, threatening to rip it from its hinges, and the rain lashed her face like 1,000 tiny, icy whips. In the flickering, unreliable lamplight that spilled out from the cabin, framed by the tumultuous, inky dark of the storm, stood a figure so wretched, so utterly broken, it barely seemed human. A young woman, native, Apache by the delicate cast of her features, her deerskin clothes, or what remained of them, soaked through and clinging to a painfully thin, trembling frame. Her long black hair was plastered to her skull, framing a face of exquisite if ravaged beauty. But it was her eyes that seized Abigail's attention, arresting her with their raw power. Wide and dark, and they were pits of a terror, so profound, so ancient. It seemed to swallow the flickering lamplight, reflecting the storm, raging both outside and within the tormented landscape of her soul. She was shaking violently, not just from the biting cold that Abigail could feel even through the cabin door, but from a deeper bone-chilling fear that vibrated through her slight form. And then Abigail saw it, and the obscene detail that spoke volumes of unimaginable cruelty. A cruel rusted iron shackle still clung with brutal tenacity to one slender bruised wrist. A short length of heavy broken chain dangled from it, like a dead metallic serpent, clinking faintly with her tremors. The girl's other hand, raw and scratched, was pressed protectively, instinctively, against her swollen belly. Pregnant. Dear God in heaven. She was with child, hunted, shackled, and carrying new life in the midst of such desolation. In that single stark instant, all thought of caution, of the town's unspoken corrosive rules, of her own precarious vulnerability as a lone widow, vanished from Abigail's mind as if swept away by the storm itself. All she saw was a fellow creature, a sister in suffering and desperate, life-threatening need. A primal empathy, deeper than any societal construct, surged through her. She pulled the door wide, her movement decisive. "Come in, child," she said, her voice gentle but firm, a command born not of authority, but of profound compassion. "Come in out of this terrible storm." The girl flinched, her terror-filled eyes darting past Abigail into the dim interior of the cabin, as if expecting a blow, or worse, the grinning faces of her pursuers. But the crushing weight of exhaustion and the relentless, bone-deep cold were clearly too much to bear any longer. She swayed precariously, her legs threatening to buckle. Abigail reached out without a second thought, her arm hardened by years of farm work, surprisingly strong. As she grasped the girl's arm, guiding the trembling, near-collapsed figure inside, away from the biting wind and the driving rain, she quickly, firmly rebolted the door, shutting out the storm's savage fury. For a moment, suspended in time, there was only the sound of the girl's ragged, shallow breathing as the frantic tattoo of the rain on the sturdy roof, and the crackle of the now reviving fire. A small, fragile island of precarious peace in a world consumed by tempest. Abigail didn't ask questions. There would be time for that later, when the immediate crisis had passed, or perhaps she sensed there would be no need for questions at all. Some stories were written not in words, but in the lines of profound suffering etched on a young face, in the haunted, vacant depths of eyes that had witnessed far too much horror for one lifetime, let alone one so young. She led the girl, no, this child, towards the warmth of the hearth, the heat slowly, tentatively beginning to penetrate her chilled body. "Let's get you out of those wet things before you catch your death," Abigail murmured, her tone practical, yet infinitely gentle, already rummaging through an old wooden chest at the foot of her bed for one of Elias's voluminous flannel nightshirts, clean and soft from countless washings, smelling faintly of lavender from the sachets she tucked among her linens. The girl, whose name Abigail would later learn was Waya. Wolf, in her native tongue, a name that hinted at a spirit not yet entirely broken, allowed herself to be helped, her movements stiff and uncoordinated, her limbs almost unresponsive. Her gaze, however, remained relentlessly alert, darting constantly to the shuttered windows, to the bolted door, as if expecting her pursuers to burst in, axes splintering the wood at any moment. As Abigail gently helped her remove the sodden deerskin tunic, she saw the angry purple-black bruises mottling the girl's arms and back, the raw, bleeding chafing on her slender wrist, where the shackle had bitten deep into her flesh. Abigail's heart ached with a sorrow so sharp it was almost a physical pain, and a cold, righteous fury began to smolder deep within her, a dangerous ember in the dry tinder of her usually placid nature. Once Waya was divested of her wet clothes and wrapped in the comforting warmth of the flannel nightshirt and a thick patchwork quilt, Abigail settled her into Elias's old creaking rocking chair, positioning it close to the life-giving fire. Then she busied herself making chamomile tea, its gentle, calming scent slowly beginning to fill the small, tense cabin. She added a generous spoonful of precious honey from her small store, hoping its sweetness might offer some small immediate comfort to a body and soul starved of any kindness. Waya watched her every move silent as a stone, her eyes still like those of a cornered wounded animal, wary of any sudden movement, any unexpected sound. Yet within those depths, Abigail thought she detected a flicker of something else. Too, something fragile and almost extinguished. A desperate nascent hope, the faintest glimmer of light in an overwhelming darkness. When Abigail offered the steaming mug, Waya's hands trembled so violently she could barely hold it, and the porcelain chattering against her teeth. Abigail gently, firmly steadied her hands with her own, guiding the cup to her chapped lips. "You're safe now." Abigail whispered the words, more a vow to herself, a line drawn in the sand, than a simple reassurance to the terrified girl. "No one will harm you here. Not while I draw breath." Waya drank the warmth, slowly spreading through her frozen limbs, her gaze fixed on Abigail's face, searching, questioning. And then, for the first time since she had stumbled half dead onto Abigail's porch, a single crystalline tear traced a path down her dirt-stained cheek. It was followed by another and then another, until silent, racking sobs shook her slender frame. A release of pent-up terror and unimaginable pain. Held too long in check, too dangerous to express until this fragile moment of sanctuary. Abigail simply sat with her on a small stool beside the rocking chair, her hand resting lightly, reassuringly on the girl's trembling shoulder, offering a silent, unwavering presence. A human anchor in the storm of her weeping. She let Waya cry until the tempest of emotion finally subsided, leaving her utterly exhausted, but breathing more evenly, her eyelids fluttering, then finally closing as sleep, or perhaps sheer, merciful oblivion claimed her. Abigail watched her for a long time, the firelight playing on the young woman's weary, beautiful face, smoothing out some of the harsh lines of suffering, revealing the youth beneath the trauma. A fierce, almost maternal protectiveness rose within Abigail, as fierce and elemental as the storm still raging with diminished fury outside. She knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, chilling and resolute, that this was more than just sheltering a desperate runaway. This was a stand, a reckoning, and she, Abigail, a solitary widow on the edge of a lawless town, had just irrevocably drawn a line in the unforgiving, blood-soaked dust of Redemption Gap. There would be consequences. She knew it as surely as she knew her own name, and she found to her own surprise that she was ready to meet them. Days bled into weeks, marked by the slow, tentative rhythm of a shared, fragile existence. Within the four walls of the cabin, a small bubble of quietude in a hostile world. Waya, for that, was indeed the name Abigail eventually gently coaxed from her in a voice barely above a whisper. "It means wolf." She had murmured one afternoon, looking out at the distant, wolf-haunted hills, a fleeting, almost imperceptible flicker of ancestral pride in her eyes. For my grandmother, who was strong, remained mostly silent for those first few weeks. Her trauma was a heavy, suffocating shroud, wrapping her in an isolating mist. She moved like a ghost through Abigail's small cabin, a wraith of memory and pain, starting violently at every unexpected sound. A floorboard creaking a log, shifting in the fire, the distant bay of a coyote. Her eyes, Abigail noticed, were constantly furtively scanning the horizon through the small, grime-streaked window, searching for any sign of pursuit. Sleep, when it came to Waya, offered little respite. It was often shattered by muffled, anguished cries and thrashing limbs as unseen horrors replayed themselves in the private theater of her nightmares. Horrors Abigail could only begin to sickeningly imagine. But Abigail was patient, her compassion a deep, unwavering well. She spoke softly, moved slowly and deliberately, and created a haven of quiet, predictable routine, hoping to mend the shattered pieces of Waya's world with threads of normalcy. She'd learned in her long, loving years with Elias that sometimes the deepest wounds needed stillness and time to heal, not clumsy, probing questions or ill-timed sympathy. Silence could be a balm presence, a comfort more profound than any words. She cooked nourishing broths from the last of her stored vegetables and the occasional rabbit she managed to snare. She kept the fire burning bright against the encroaching autumn chill, its flames a small defiance against the darkness both outside and within. And she simply existed alongside the Waya, a steady, unassuming presence, a silent promise of safety, my village. Waya began one evening, her voice so low, Abigail had to lean closer to hear over the crackle of the fire. Waya was staring into the flames, her hands restlessly pleating a fold in the quilt Abigail had draped over her. And to the people. We call ourselves, we lived by the Whispering Falls. The water there, it sang to us. The spirits of the ancestors were in that song. She paused, a shadow falling across her delicate features, extinguishing the faint light the memory had kindled. Then the Na-Kai, the long knives, they came. Not soldiers with the blue coats and bugles. Different men, their faces were like stone without spirits. Their eyes, she shivered, like winter ice. Slowly, painstakingly, like coaxing a terrified bird from a thicket, fragments of Waya's unimaginable ordeal began to surface. They didn't emerge in a coherent narrative, but in broken phrases, choked whispers, sudden stark gestures, and in the raw, unfiltered emotion that sometimes overwhelmed her, leaving her gasping and trembling. Abigail would often find her staring at the place behind the cabin, where they had buried the rusted shackle. Abigail had carefully removed it, with Elias's old blacksmith tools and the iron biting cold and heavy in her own hand, a tangible symbol of inhumanity. At Waya's unspoken but desperate request, communicated through haunted eyes and a rigid pointing finger, Abigail had taken it out back and buried it deep in the hard earth, as if to lay that particular vicious ghost to rest. Waya sometimes went to stand over the spot, her lips moving silently. One gray afternoon, as Abigail was kneading dough for a meager loaf of bread, her movements rhythmic and soothing, Waya picked up a charred piece of charcoal from the hearth and a smoothed piece of pine board that Abigail used for chopping vegetables. She began to draw. The figures were crude, stick-like, almost childish in their simplicity. But the story they told was utterly chilling. A hieroglyphic of horror. Men on horseback, their figures larger, more menacing than the others. Fire-stylized flames consuming round dome-shaped dwellings. Wickiups, smaller stick figures, clearly women and children being roped like cattle and dragged away their drawn arms, conveying helplessness. Then a dark enclosed space, perhaps a cave or a windowless building crammed with many huddled figures, their faces left blank, signifying, Abigail thought, the erasure of their identity, their despair. Most chillingly, Waya drew one figure larger than the others, who wore the star of a lawman, his drawn face a cruel sneer, and another, a portly man with a distinctive broad hat, standing beside him, pointing Croft. Abigail's stomach tightened. The detail with which Waya then drew the thick bars on a tiny window, and the heavy, unmistakable bolt on a crudely rendered door, spoke volumes of days and nights spent staring at those symbols of her captivity. Through these fragmented accounts, these stark drawings, and Waya's often repressed but potent emotional reactions, Abigail began to piece together the horrifying mosaic of the nightmare. Waya's village, a small, peaceful Apache settlement, one of the last free bands in that part of the territory, nestled in a hidden valley blessed with water and game, had been raided. Not by soldiers in any official capacity, Waya managed to convey, through a painful mix of heavily accented broken English, a few vital Apache words. Abigail was beginning to understand, and vivid, heart-wrenching gestures. The attackers were ruthless white men, and their faces hard and unpitying, and their eyes cold and calculating, and they weren't interested in land, not directly, and they were looking for captives, specifically for women and older children, for labor, for sport, for profit. The journey that followed had been brutal. A forced march of many days under a harsh, unforgiving sun with little food and less water. Nights were spent shivering in makeshift open-air pens like animals destined for slaughter or sometimes tied to trees. Some of the weaker ones, the very old and the very young, hadn't survived. Waya's own grandmother, she conveyed with a silent, tear-filled gesture of an old woman falling and not rising, had perished on that march. Then came the selling. Waya's eyes would glaze over when she tried to describe this part. Her breath coming in shallow, painful gasps, her hands clenching and unclenching. Like selling horses or cattle. She choked out one day, her voice raw with shame and a burning, impotent fury. They looked at our teeth, at our hands. They prodded, touched. She shuddered violently, and Abigail reached out to lay a comforting hand on her arm. Men from here. Waya whispered, her gaze flicking towards the direction of Redemption Gap. From the town I saw them, I remember faces. The storeman, the one with the small greedy eyes, and the one who wears the shiny star, they were there. Watching, sometimes choosing. Abigail's blood ran cold. It wasn't just complicity through silence or turning a blind eye. Jedediah Croft, Sheriff Brody. Directly involved architects of this horror, or at the very least, key facilitators. Buyers. Their usual bluster and small-town tyranny paled in comparison to this deeper, organized evil. Waya had been held, as she managed to communicate in a dark, damp tool shed, not just any shed, but one Abigail horrifyingly realized from Waya's descriptions of the sounds and smells. Horses, leather manure, the clanging of a blacksmith's hammer from nearby, was likely located at the back of the livery stable, which stood directly adjacent to Sheriff Brody's office and the town's small crude jail. The shed was cramped, airless. The pervasive stench of fear, unwashed bodies, and human waste clinging to the damp earth floor. Her captors, sometimes deputies she recognized from their brief, cruel interactions during her initial capture, their faces leering in the gloom of the shed. Other times, rougher, unfamiliar men who seemed to take orders from someone who lurked in the shadows beyond the shed door, his voice a low growl. Starved them, sometimes beat them for sport, their coarse laughter echoing in the oppressive darkness. They had mocked her swollen belly, calling her unborn child a half-breed burden, a worthless addition that made her less valuable. The other women Waya conveyed with heartbreaking, desolate clarity, tears streaming unheeded down her face, were taken away, one by one. Sometimes in the dead of night, their stifled cries and the sounds of struggle quickly muffled. Sometimes even in broad daylight, but hidden shamefully under tarpaulins in the back of wagons, spirited away like stolen goods. Some were destined for railroad bosses. She'd overheard one of the captors bragging to be used as cooks and laundresses, and worse, for the crews laying track further west. Others were bound for remote mining camps far south, places from which it was understood no one ever returned. She knew with a chilling absolute certainty born of shared whispers and desperate observation that none of them ever came back to the shed. Their vacant spaces were soon filled with new captives. One man. Waya whispered late one night, her voice trembling as she drew a crude symbol on the hearthstone with a piece of charcoal. A circle with a jagged lightning bolt-like line etched through it. He wore this on a big shiny ring on his finger. He was not from the town. He came on a fine horse with other men who were not from here. He decided who went where. He was the boss of it, bigger, scarier even than Brody or the store man. Their usual bluster vanished when he spoke. They were afraid of him too, I think. This detail, this unknown, more powerful figure named Thorne, snagged like a burr in Abigail's mind. A deeper, more organized layer to the wickedness stretching far beyond the confines of Redemption Gap. Her escape, Waya finally revealed, had been an act of sheer desperate courage, a flight fueled by the fierce, primal, unquenchable need to protect her unborn child. One night, one of her regular captors, a brutal, slovenly man Waya called Pig Eye because of his small, mean-spirited eyes, had been particularly drunk and careless. He had failed to properly secure the heavy wooden bolt on the flimsy shed door. The moon was a mere sliver obscured by gathering clouds, and the town was deep in sleep, its few honest inhabitants locked behind their doors. Barefoot, her only possessions, the rags she wore, and the hated rusted chain on her wrist serving as a constant painful reminder of her captivity, Waya had slipped out into the oppressive, suffocating darkness. She didn't know where she was going, had no plan beyond putting as much distance as possible between herself and that hellish shed. She ran blindly, instinctively through dark, narrow alleyways, across silent open fields, and the sounds of the sleeping town fading behind her like a nightmare receding with the dawn. The vast, indifferent wilderness ahead offered a terrifying unknown alternative, but it was preferable to the certain horrors of the shed. The storm, the very one that had driven her to Abigail's doorstep, had been both a terror and a heaven-sent cover. Its violence washing away her tracks, its roar cloaking the sounds of her desperate flight. How she had stumbled upon Abigail's isolated lamplit cabin in the heart of that maelstrom miles from the town, she couldn't say, "The spirits of my ancestors." She murmured, a look of awe in her eyes. They guided my exhausted, stumbling steps. They led me to the one who had not forgotten the old ways of kindness, the one whose heart still knew compassion. Listening to Waya's fragmented, excruciatingly painful recollections, watching her draw those stark, silent images of suffering, Abigail felt a cold, righteous fury solidify within her, displacing the fear that had initially chilled her. The vague whispers she'd heard over the years, the gnawing unease she'd felt about the moral decay of Redemption Gap, now coalesced into a horrifying, undeniable certainty. Her town, the place where she had built a life with Elias, was rotten to its very core. A filthy, thriving hub in a vile, despicable trade of human lives. The men who ran it, who profited from it, who maintained its veneer of rough respectability, were monsters cloaked in the mundane garb of storekeepers and lawmen. Jedediah Croft, with his unctuous, false smiles, and his seemingly well-stocked store built on a foundation of human misery. Sheriff Brody, with his carefully maintained facade of law and order, a law that served only the powerful and the cruel. They were not just complicit, they were architects of this evil, their hands stained indelibly with the suffering of innocents like Waya and countless others. Abigail's small, humble cabin, once just a home, a repository of memories, now felt like something more. It felt like a fortress, a tiny, besieged island of defiance in a vast, dark sea of corruption and inhumanity. The fear was still there. Of course, a cold, venomous serpent coiling in the pit of her stomach whenever she thought of the power arrayed against them. She was one woman, a widow of dwindling resources, against a town's entrenched, malignant secret. But looking at Waya, at the gentle, almost imperceptible swell of her belly that held a new innocent life, a life that deserved to be born, free from shackles and fear, Abigail's quiet resolve hardened into the tempered steel of unyielding conviction, and she would not let them have Waya. She would not let them extinguish this fragile, precious spark of hope. She would stand for Elias, for Waya, for the unborn child, for decency itself. "We'll face them together, child," Abigail said one evening, her voice firm. Waya, hearing the steel in the older woman's voice, found a flicker of her own Apache fire rekindle. "I have dreamed," Waya whispered, "of my child, Talon running free under the sky like a young hawk." Abigail squeezed her hand. "Then we fight for that dream, Waya, for Talon's freedom." The fragile peace within the confines of Abigail's cabin was a stark, glaring contrast to the growing palpable tension that began to emanate from Redemption Gap. It was a small town, after all, a place where secrets, especially those involving a reclusive widow, an unfamiliar horse sometimes seen near her property, Waya's had been found wandering, and Abigail had with immense difficulty managed to corral it into her small dilapidated barn. And the persistent, mysterious plume of smoke rising from her chimney, had a way of seeping through the cracks in the facade of everyday life, spreading like an insidious vine. Abigail noticed it first in the subtle, almost imperceptible shifts in behavior when she ventured into town for essential supplies. A journey she now undertook with Elias's loaded Colt holstered at her hip. A grim and unaccustomed weight ease that once might have offered a cursory nod now slid away from hers, finding sudden interest in the dusty boardwalk or a distant cloud. The usual curt greetings from the few townsfolk she still occasionally interacted with ceased altogether, replaced by a heavy, watchful silence, or worse, overtly hostile stares from men she recognized as Croft's cronies. At Croft's general store, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken accusation. Jedediah himself, a man whose usual demeanor was one of oily, ingratiating affability when coin was to be made, now met her with a cool, appraising stare, his small porcine eyes glittering with something akin to malice. "Supplies are running a bit low on several fronts, Abigail," he'd said on her last visit, his voice smooth as polished riverstone, but with a dangerous undercurrent she didn't like. He leaned conspiratorially over the counter, his breath smelling faintly of stale tobacco and something else. Something rotten. "Harsh winter coming, you know. Folks are stocking up best to be prepared and not take on any unnecessary burdens." He paused, letting the implication hang heavy in the air, like the ubiquitous dust motes dancing in the grimy sunbeams, slanting through the store's front window. His gaze flickered meaningfully towards her near-empty shopping basket. Credit's getting a bit tight these days, too, for certain individuals. "I pay my way, Jedediah, as you well know." Abigail had replied, her voice low and steady, her expression unreadable, though inside her heart hammered, "Always have, always will." Croft had merely offered a thin, unpleasant smirk. "Indeed, Abigail, indeed. But as I said, unnecessary burdens, well, they can become terribly expensive in the long run. For everyone involved." The threat was clear, unambiguous. They knew, or at least they suspected strongly. Sheriff Brody paid his first direct visit on a crisp, late autumn afternoon. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the dying leaves of the few cottonwoods near Abigail's cabin rustled like dry paper in the cool breeze. He rode up alone, his horse, a muscular buckskin, kicking up small clouds of amber dust that settled slowly in the still air. Abigail watched him approach from her small kitchen window, Waya shrinking back into the shadows of the cabin behind her, her hand instinctively going to her belly. Abigail's own hand tightened on the Winchester she'd leaned near the door, its cool wood a stark reassurance. She met him on the porch, her posture deliberately straight, her shoulders back, her gaze steady and direct. "Sheriff," she said, her voice calm, devoid of welcome, but equally devoid of outward agitation. "Abigail," he replied, tipping his sweat-stained hat a fraction of an inch. His eyes, the color of faded denim, scanned the cabin behind her, lingering on the door. "The windows, just making my rounds, checking on folks. Heard you might have some company." His tone was deceptively casual. "I have a visitor, yes." Abigail stated, her voice even. "A young woman in need of shelter and care. The good book does say to welcome the stranger, Sheriff." Brody's thin lips thinned further. Some strangers are best left to wander on, Abigail, especially when they might be trouble. There's considerable talk in town and further afield of a runaway Apache squaw. Caused a bit of a stir with some important folks. Folks who don't take kindly to their property being misplaced. His gaze hardened. "Man by the name of Thorne, I believe. Apparently this Apache witnessed something she shouldn't have. Knows things. He's a man who doesn't like loose ends, Abigail, and he pays well for their return." "Property sheriff." Abigail echoed, her voice dangerously mild. "Last I checked, the good Lord made people not property. This young woman is no trouble to me. Just a word of caution, Abigail. For your own good, Redemption Gap values its peace. We don't like complications." His voice dropped. "There's a substantial reward from interests outside of Redemption Gap. Powerful interests, Thorn. He doesn't like loose ends." He watched her face intently. The name Thorn resonated chillingly with Waya's drawing of the man with a distinctive ring. This conspiracy was far larger, but she kept her face a calm, unreadable mask. "I know nothing of any Mr. Thorn, Sheriff," Abigail replied. "I am merely offering Christian charity to a soul in need." Brody's eyes narrowed. "Charity can be a mighty costly virtue in these parts, Abigail," he said softly, his voice now laced with an undeniable menace. "Real costly. If you hear anything, you let me know directly." He touched the brim of his hat again, then turned his horse and rode off, leaving Abigail with a chilling certainty. They knew, and they would not rest. That night, with Waya asleep and a sliver of moon casting long dancing shadows, Abigail knew she couldn't just wait for their next move. Brody's mention of Thorn, a man powerful enough to make the sheriff nervous, spelled a danger far exceeding local thuggery. If Waya had seen this, Thorn, her life, and Abigail's by extension, was worth less than spent powder. She had to know more, risk or no risk. Wrapping herself in Elias's old Duster shotgun loaded with birdshot, quieter if need be, but still persuasive, she slipped out. The horse Waya had arrived on, now fed and somewhat rested in Abigail's lean-to, was her unwilling transport. Town was a couple of miles, and every shadow seemed to hold a watching eye. Croft's store. If secrets were currency in Redemption, Gap's till wasn't the only thing overflowing. The town was buttoned up tight at the Dry Gulch Saloon, and the only place spilling light and raucous noise into the street, Croft's general store, was dark, a hulking silhouette against the faint starlight. She tethered the horse in a deep patch of shadow behind the abandoned smithy, then moved like a whisper along the back alley. The rear door to Croft's store was notoriously flimsy. Elias had often remarked on it, a sturdy stick used as a lever, a muffled crack, and she was in. The air inside was thick with the mingled scents of new denim coffee beans, axle grease, and something else. Croft's own sour tobacco and avarice. Using a small tinderbox and a sliver of candle, she navigated to the cluttered office at the back, where Croft kept his ledgers, and the main ledger, the one for public show, was neat. But under a loose floorboard, Elias had pointed out years ago, saying, "A man like Croft always has 2 sets of books, Abby one for the devil." She found another, smaller oilskin-wrapped book. Its contents, scrawled in Croft's spidery hand, were far more revealing. Columns of names, dates, and sums that spoke not of calico and beans, but of stock, itemized by age, sex, and condition. Payments to be. Brody, no doubt, for procurement, and silence. And then, chillingly, several entries referred to T or Cousin T, with larger sums received for prime selections and discrete transfers. One entry read, "Cousin T expressed satisfaction with latest acquisition. Payment wired via Wells Fargo note. He is particularly displeased by loose tongues. Emphasize discretion to B." Beneath it, a loose folded letter tucked into the ledger. The paper was finer than anything Croft usually handled, the script elegant, commanding. It was short, detailing arrangements for a shipment and signed with a flourish and an insignia. A circle with a jagged lightning bolt, Thorn. And the letter began, "Jedediah, my dear cousin." Abigail's breath hitched. Croft wasn't just a fly in Thorn's web. He was kin, a trusted lieutenant hiding in plain sight as a small-town merchant. This wasn't just a local rot. It was a diseased root system spreading deep. She memorized key details of the insignia, the confirmation of the familial tie. Taking nothing but the knowledge a far heavier burden than any stolen goods, she replaced the ledger, fixed the floorboard, and slipped out as silently as she'd come. The ride back was fraught, every rustle of sagebrush a potential pursuer. She knew now. This wasn't just about saving Waya. This was about exposing a darkness that threatened to swallow the whole territory. And Jedediah Croft Thorne's cousin was the linchpin in Redemption Gap. The brittle, watchful quiet of the following 2 days was shattered by the sudden, unwelcome thud of multiple hooves and the sharp metallic jingle of harnesses. Abigail had been expecting them. She looked through the small, grimy pane of the front window and saw Sheriff Brody this time, not alone. He had his 2 regular deputies with him. Hank, a hard-bitten older man, known for his quick temper and loyalty to Brody, and young Billy, barely a man, perpetually nervous, and trailing sullenly behind them on foot were Croft's 2 thugs, Tom and Pike Jedediah. Croft himself was there too, mounted on a sleek black mare, his usual merchant's apron conspicuously replaced by a stern dark frock coat. A chilling new detail caught Abigail's eye. Pike carried a distinct 5-gallon tin of kerosene, its purpose grimly obvious, and Tom clutched a bundle of greasy rags. They weren't just here for Waya. They were prepared to eradicate the problem entirely, to burn out any trace of defiance. Waya, who had been resting by the dwindling fire, sat bolt upright, her eyes wide with stark terror. "They come," she whispered, her voice a choked sound. "They come for me, for my baby. Stay inside, Waya." Abigail commanded, her voice remarkably firm. "Bolt the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone but me." She took Elias's heavy double-barreled shotgun from the wooden pegs above the mantelpiece. She broke it open, checked the load, 2 brass shells packed with heavy buckshot. She took a deep, steadying breath, picturing Elias's calm, resolute face, and walked out onto the porch, pulling the sturdy oak door shut behind her. The click of the heavy iron bolt sliding into place from inside was a small, reassuring sound. Brody and his entourage had reined in their horses just beyond her small, struggling rose garden. The sheriff dismounted his deputies, fanning out to flank him, and their hands resting deliberately on their holstered guns. Croft remained mounted, a silent, malevolent observer. Tom and Pike positioned themselves slightly behind the deputies' expressions of brutish anticipation. Pike setting the kerosene tin down with a deliberate thud. "Abigail." Brody began, his voice flat, hard, and uncompromising. "We're here for the Apache girl. We have papers." He held up a rolled-up scroll, a document Abigail knew was a sham. "She's a fugitive, wanted for theft and assault. We're taking her in by order of the territorial marshal." Hank spat a stream of tobacco juice into Abigail's petunias. "She ain't worth arguing over, old woman. Just give her up peaceful-like." Pike smirked, revealing stained teeth, and patted the kerosene tin. "Yeah. Just make it easy on yourself, Grandma. Don't want you getting hurt or your place getting too warm over some savage." Abigail stood her ground on the top step of the porch, the shotgun held loosely but ready at her side. "She is under my protection, Sheriff Brody, and she has committed no crime that I know of, save the crime of trying to survive the brutality of men like you. Men who plan to burn down a woman's home. That's not for you to decide, Abigail." Brody said, his eyes narrowing. Hank took a deliberate, menacing step forward. Abigail raised the shotgun slightly. The faint click as her thumb found the safety was audible. "This is my property, Sheriff. And that girl is a guest in my home. A pregnant girl, Sheriff, who has been beaten, starved, and terrorized. I saw the chains. You call that justice. She's Apache property, Abigail, that's what she is, stolen from rightful owners," Croft interjected from his horse. His voice sharp, betraying a flicker of anxiety. Abigail now understood. "And you stubborn old woman, are interfering with lawful business that keeps this town from drying up. Business that keeps my cousin." He caught himself face flushing. "Keeps important people satisfied. Lawful business." Abigail's voice, though not loud, carried with cold contempt. selling human beings like they were cattle raiding villages. That is not a law, I recognize. It's the law of devils and thieves. Jedediah Croft, cousin to devils perhaps. Croft's face went white with fury and alarm. You're an old woman, Abigail. Alone. Brody said, taking another step, his hand on his Colt, trying to regain control. We will take the girl one way or another. Tom and Pike edged forward, eager. Suddenly Pike, impatient and eager to impress Croft, his eyes gleaming with brutish cruelty, broke ranks. Enough of this damned yapping, you old hag. For he snarled, bounding up the porch steps with surprising speed. A wicked-looking skinning knife suddenly appearing in his hand, clearly aiming to gut the door or anyone who opened it. Abigail didn't hesitate. The shotgun in her hands roared a deafening explosion. The blast of buckshot tore a ragged gash in the porch wood an inch from Pike's knee, spinning him around with a howl of mingled shock and agony, his knife clattering uselessly as he fell clutching his bleeding leg. Before the echoes died, Hank's gun was in his hand muzzle leveled at Abigail's chest. You crazy old bitch. He screamed, his finger tightening on the trigger. Young Billy had his pistol half-drawn, hand shaking. Hold your fire, Hank, damn it, hold. Brody barked, face a mask of fury. But beneath it, Abigail saw calculation, a wounded or dead respected widow, especially one who clearly knew more than she let on, was bad for business. It could attract unwanted outside attention to Thorne's operations, especially if his cousin's name got tangled up in it. You want her? Abigail said, her voice preternaturally low, smoke curling from the shotgun barrels now centered on Brody's chest. You'll have to step through me first, and Elias taught me how to use this well enough that at least one of you won't be walking away. Are you willing to pay that price? Sheriff is Mr. Croft for his cousin. The silence was absolute. Brody's eyes narrowed. He saw no fear, only grim, lethal determination. He knew Abigail's reputation as a crack shot. A public, violent confrontation with these new dangerous implications could ignite a firestorm. Bring in federal marshals not on Thorne's payroll. He held up a hand, almost imperceptibly. For a long, agonizing moment, he stared at Abigail. Then, with a curt nod, he slowly, reluctantly began to back away. This isn't over, Abigail. He said, his voice tight with suppressed anger and humiliation. You're making a grave mistake, a fatal one, perhaps. He remounted his deputies and Croft's men nursing Pike, who was now whimpering. Looked uncertain and their bravado deflated. Jedediah Croft shot Abigail a look of pure venom mixed with a new raw fear. You'll regret this, you meddling old hag, he spat, wheeling his horse. They rode away, not with swagger, but with the sullen retreat of thwarted bullies. Abigail stood ramrod straight until they were out of sight. Only then did she lower the weapon, her arms trembling. The immediate danger had passed, but Brody was right. It wasn't over. That night, Abigail knew they couldn't stay. Why? She said, her voice urgent. They'll be back and angrier. My mention of Croft's cousin shook them, but Thorne will not be deterred by a widow with a shotgun. Elias had an old hunting line cabin deep in the pines near Wolf's Howl Canyon. It's rough, hard to find. We leave at first light, try to use the snow to cover our tracks if it starts. Waya nodded, fear and determination in her eyes. Can we trust him? She'd asked earlier when Reverend Matthews had stopped by, a grim foreshadowing he'd offered solace. A kind word, then inquired too casually about Abigail's well-being, if she'd seen anything unusual. Abigail had been non-committal, but a seed of deep apprehension was planted regarding the Reverend. Just before dawn, a frantic rapping came at the back door. It was Mrs. Henderson, a widow from the edge of town, her face pale in the gloom, her breath clouding in the frigid air. Abigail, I overheard. Matthews's boy. He ran to Brody. Not an hour passed. Matthews himself told them everything he suspected after his visit yesterday. They know you might run to the line cabin. They're gathering a larger posse. With Thorne's own hired guns this time, harder men than Brody's usual curs, they aimed to surround the cabin. And Sheriff said something about making sure it's a clean sweep. Tom and Pike were seen carrying more oil and fresh rags. They mean to burn you out. Abigail, burn it all down with you inside. The betrayal hit Abigail like a physical blow. Matthews, the pious fraud, his earlier kindly inquiry. A recon mission had sold them out for favor or fear. No time. Waya now through the back into the trees. Abigail grabbed the Winchester and a small bundle of supplies already packed. They plunged into the pre-dawn chill as the first snowflakes began to fall, a biting wind whipping around them. Behind they heard the distant sound of hooves, guttural shouts. The chase was on. Abigail, driven by a lifetime of grit, pushed them onward. Waya, her breath ragged, stumbled, but kept pace, clutching her belly, the need to protect Talon of fire within her. The snow fell harder, a blessing and a curse obscuring their trail, but slowing them. I slow us. Waya gasped, leaning against a frozen pine, her face ashen. Leave me, Abigail, save yourself. Hush now, child. Abigail urged, pulling her forward. Elias always told me true grit ain't about never feeling fear. It's about looking it square in the eye and spitting back. We push on for Talon. We push on. Waya found a sliver of new strength. Nako, she whispered more to herself. He hunted bear with less spirit than this, he would say. Find the spirit of the wolf within. The baying of Brody's hounds grew closer, echoing eerily through the falling snow. They're on us. Waya cried, looking back with wide, terrified eyes. Abigail spotted a narrow, snow-choked ravine, a gash in the earth. In here, quick. They scrambled down loose scree and snow, dislodging with their descent collapsing against the icy rock. The cold was seeping into their bones, numbing their extremities. Waya shivered violently near collapse. I can't go further. You must, child. Abigail urged, her own lungs burning her breath, pluming like smoke. For Talon we fight. As long as we draw breath, we fight. Voices echoed above, closer now. Sheriff Brody. Spread out. She can't have gotten far. Thorne will have our scalps if that Apache whelp talks. Croft's shrill voice. Thorne will have our hides if that Apache bitch escapes. She saw his face, and that old woman knows too much about family. Then a new voice, cold and cruel one that sent a shiver down Abigail's spine, despite the Winchester in her hands. Your methods are sloppy, Sheriff. The voice drawled, dripping with contempt. Mr. Thorne expects results, not excuses. The girl has seen his face, perhaps even knows who he is. She doesn't leave these hills alive. And neither does the old woman. If she's with her, there's a bonus for no loose ends. This was one of Thorne's men, more dangerous than Brody or his cronies. Abigail knew this was it. She cocked the Winchester, its click loud in the sudden hush, her face a mask of cold resolve. She wouldn't let them take Waya without a fight to the death. As a dark figure bulkier than the others appeared at the ravine's edge, rifle glinting, it was Pike eagerness overcoming his earlier wound. He let out a cry. They're down here in the cut? A rifle barked from above the bullet, whizzing past Abigail's head, to thud into the snow beside Waya, sending up a spray of white. It was the cold-voiced man, Cutter. Last chance, ladies, come out, or we drag you out in pieces. Never, Abigail yelled back, leveling the Winchester towards Cutter's silhouette. Pike, emboldened, started to scramble down the loose rock of the ravine wall. I'll fetch him, boss. Abigail swung the rifle and fired without conscious thought. The shot caught Pike in the shoulder, spinning him with a yelp as he tumbled awkwardly down the slope, landing in a heap. Before anyone else could react, another of Thorne's men tried to follow, and Abigail, knowing the Winchester was slower to reload, used its heavy stock like a club. meeting him with a crack of wood against bone that sent him reeling back from the edge. A tense quiet fell, broken only by Pike's groans and Waya's ragged breathing. They have us trapped, Shikis. Waya whispered, her eyes hollow with despair. From the past, too. I hear more horses. Abigail listened. Waya was right. More hoofbeats cutting off any retreat. This truly was the end of the line. As more dark figures appeared at the ravine's edge, silhouetted against the swirling snow, and Cutter raised his rifle for a deliberate shot, a new sound pierced the air, a long, ululating war cry, fierce and terrifying. Then another and another, echoing from the surrounding ridges, seemingly from the very heart of the blizzard. Brody's men froze. What in damnation? Hank muttered, his face paling. Cutter lowered his rifle, slightly confused. Suddenly, like phantoms materializing from the white curtain of the snowstorm, a dozen Apache warriors appeared on the high ground on both sides of the ravine. Bows drawn, their painted faces fearsome in the dim, stormy light. Leading them, tall and commanding on a magnificent paint horse, was a warrior whose eyes burned like coals. Waya choked back a sob. Disbelief and joy warring on her face. Nako, her husband. He had found them. His warriors had laid a perfect ambush. Brody's posse outmaneuvered, caught in a deadly crossfire, and utterly unnerved by the sudden spectral appearance of the warriors, faltered. It's a trap. Young Billy shrieked, dropping his rifle and raising his hands. Cutter Thorne's man snarled, "Don't be fools, there's only a handful of savages." But his words died as an arrow thudded into the snow mere inches from his boot, followed by a volley that pinned the posse down, arrows whizzing past their heads like angry hornets. Hank yelped as an arrow tore through his sleeve. "Withdraw!" Brody yelled, his voice cracking with terror. "Back to town now!" They scrambled away in complete disarray, a panicked rout, some on horseback, some on foot, leaving Pike and the other injured man behind, caring only for their own skins. Abigail and Waya were left under the watchful eyes of Nako and his braves. Nako dismounted, striding towards Waya. He swept her into an embrace that spoke of endless miles and unbearable worry. Then his gaze fell on Abigail, still holding the Winchester, her face streaked with grime and resolve. He looked from her to Waya, and then back to Abigail, a deep understanding in his fiery eyes. He gave a single profound nod, a warrior's respect to another. He lifted Waya onto his horse tenderly, one last look at Abigail, a silent promise of eternal gratitude. Then he and his warriors melted into the snowstorm as silently as they had come. Spirits of the wilderness claiming their own. Abigail sagged against the ravine wall, relief and sorrow warring within her. They were safe. The confrontation on the porch, Matthews's treachery, and the desperate chase had left an uneasy, almost poisonous stillness over Redemption Gap. And Abigail's homestead, winter deepened, isolating Abigail further. Food became dangerously scarce. Elias's stores were dwindling. Yet a quiet bond deepened between the two women in the isolated line cabin. Elias had built a rough sanctuary against the howling wind. Waya spoke of her people, the end of their ways, their gods. She taught Abigail Apache words. "Ah, hey, thank you, Shikis. My friend, Elias." Abigail once said, her voice thick with unshed tears, as they shared a meager stew of dried beans and a snared snowshoe hare. He would have liked you, Waya, he believed in the spirit of a person, not the color of their skin. Waya, in turn, confessed a secret fear one blustery night, the wind clawing at the cabin. "I am afraid, Shikis, that my child will carry my sorrows, the shadow of the shackle." Abigail held her close, the rough blanket coarse against her own worn dress. "No, child, your son will carry your strength, your fight, the spirit of the wolf that is your name. He will be a chief among men, because his mother was a queen among women." As the moon waxed towards its fullest in the frozen heart of winter, the snow moon Waya's time drew near. The labor began on a night when the world outside was utterly silent and frozen, solid under a sky brittle with stars. It was long and arduous. Abigail stayed by her side, boiling snow for water, murmuring prayers to a God she hoped was listening across the vast, indifferent wilderness, recalling dimly remembered wisdom from her own mother. Just as the first fragile tendrils of pale pink light touched the eastern horizon, painting the snow-covered peaks with a delicate blush, Waya gave one final piercing cry. Her child was born. A boy. Small, perfectly formed his cry, surprisingly lusty and strong in the frozen stillness of the dawn. Waya gazed down at her son, her face pale and sweat-streaked, illuminated by utter exhaustion, profound wonder, and a love so fierce it seemed to fill the tiny cold cabin. "Talon," she whispered, looking at Abigail with shining eyes. "His name is Talon, for the sharpness of the hawk's talon that will help him survive, for the strength to hold on to life, to hope." Abigail nodded, her own eyes misty, her heart overflowing. A new life born under a silent winter moon in a besieged cabin, protected by extraordinary courage and unexpected friendship. For a few precious weeks after Talon's birth, a fragile peace settled over Abigail's homestead. She had eventually carefully moved them back to her main cabin when the immediate threat seemed to have passed and Waya needed more comfort. Waya devoted herself to Talon, her earlier despair slowly being replaced by a quiet, determined joy. Abigail never truly relaxed her vigil, always checking the Winchester, always listening to the sounds of the night. She knew their respite was temporary. Men like Thorne, with cousins like Croft whispering in their ear, did not forgive or forget witnesses to their empires of cruelty. Then, one bright, clear morning, with the first hints of a thaw in the air, Waya, standing by the window, gazing out at the sun-dazzled snow, gave a sudden, sharp, indrawn cry. Not of fear, Abigail registered instantly, but of something else. Disbelief shock and an almost unbearable nascent joy. She pointed a trembling finger towards the distant tree line, where the forest met the open plain. Nako. She breathed the name of prayer. A lone rider emerged on a powerful paint horse, his silhouette stark against the rising sun, fringed buckskins, long black hair flowing, a rifle resting across his lap. An Apache warrior. In his prime, it was indeed Nako. Against all odds, through the deep snows and bitter cold of a brutal winter, he had come. He had tracked them. He rode slowly, his gaze fixed on the cabin. Not with aggression, but with an unreadable intensity. Waya, clutching Talon tightly wrapped in a soft rabbit fur blanket Abigail had made, stumbled out onto the porch, heedless of the lingering chill. Nako dismounted, his movements fluid and powerful, walking towards them. He stopped a few feet away, his stern, wind-chapped features softening with a look of such profound love and unbearable anguish for what she had endured that it brought tears to Abigail's own eyes as she watched from the doorway. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching Talon's tiny cheek, then Waya's tear-stained face. No words were needed. Their reunion transcended language, a testament to a bond that neither distance nor brutality could sever. He had crossed hostile territories, Waya would later tell Abigail, in hushed, awe-filled tones, tracking her with relentless tenacity, guided by intuition, prayer, a tracker's skill honed since boyhood, and a love that refused to be extinguished by the slaving dens of Redemption Gap or the vastness of the winter wilderness. Nako gently took Talon, holding his son. For the first time, a look of fierce tenderness transforming his warrior's face. He murmured something soft in Apache, a blessing or a promise. Then he turned his gaze to Abigail, who stood quietly by the porch rail. In their dark depths, she saw profound understanding, ancestral wisdom, and an immense unspoken gratitude. He made a subtle, sweeping gesture with his free hand towards Waya and Talon. then towards Abigail, encompassing the cabin, the land, the protection she had offered. Then he bowed his head, once a slow, deliberate inclination, a warrior's solemn acknowledgement, a debt recognized between equals. He swung back onto his horse with effortless grace, lifting Waya and the baby up behind him, as if they weighed nothing. Waya looked back at Abigail, her eyes shining, her lips forming a silent, "Ah-hey-hey, shikis?" Abigail nodded, a lump in her throat, managing a small, brave smile. Nako, with one last long, searching look at Abigail, a look that conveyed more than words ever could, turned his horse towards the wild, open spaces, towards the mountains that were their true home. They melted back into the wilderness, leaving only faint hoofprints in the pristine, thawing snow. Abigail watched until they disappeared into the shimmering distance. A profound, bittersweet peace settled over her. They were safe. No one from Redemption Gap would dare follow now. The chilling memory of that spectral Apache ambush, coupled with the certain knowledge that Nako and his warriors were out there watching, would quell any pursuit far more effectively than any locked door or loaded gun. Life in Redemption Gap eventually settled, but something fundamental had shifted, an invisible fracture in its rotten foundations. The story of the reclusive widow, Abigail the Apache girl, and the spectral warriors became a whispered, uneasy legend, embellished with each telling a chilling fireside tale. For some, a nagging prick of conscience; for others, Abigail retreated further into her solitude, tinged now, not with loneliness, but with a quiet, unshakable pride. Brody Croft and their cohorts watched her with festering hatred and a new grudging, fearful respect. They left her strictly alone, perhaps fearing her unquantifiable moral certainty as much as the potential for more unwanted, dangerous attention from beyond the town's borders. The letter she'd found confirming Croft's tie to Thorn remained her secret. A card unplayed, but its knowledge lent her an inner steel. Years passed, etching new lines onto Abigail's face, but not into her spirit. Then word came like a slow-burning fuse, finally reaching powder, a full-scale federal investigation into human trafficking and peonage rings across the territories. Redemption Gap's sullied name surfaced, early Waya's story meticulously documented by a tenacious, unsmiling federal agent who had, through astonishing persistence, tracked her and Nako to their remote free settlement high in the mountains, provided a crucial breakthrough. Her unwavering testimony, naming Brody Croft, his deputies, and Reverend Matthews as Thorne's local cogs in the machine of human misery, became a damning indictment. She described Thorne, the man with the cold eyes, and the distinctive jagged lightning ring on his finger. Abigail, approached by grave federal agents who treated her with quiet, profound respect, told her own story simply, without embellishment. Her account corroborated Waya's, her quiet dignity lending irrefutable weight. She produced the rusted shackle she had kept buried, a tangible piece of evidence that spoke volumes. She spoke of the letter in Croft's ledger, confirming his familial tie to the elusive Thorne, a connection that helped the agents widen their net significantly. Faced with mounting evidence and Abigail's unshakable testimony, Reverend Matthews, his facade of piety crumbling, confessed his role as an informant, and his knowledge of the town's dark dealings, his duplicity finally exposed to the harsh light of justice. The slaving ring unraveled with surprising speed. Arrests were made not just in Redemption Gap, but across several territories. Sheriff Brody, stripped of his badge in a humiliating public ceremony, was taken away in irons. Jedediah Croft, his store impounded, his lies, exhausted, followed his unctuous smiles replaced by a terrified pallor. Other townsfolk, those who had profited or turned a blind eye, faced their own reckonings. Redemption Gap was plunged into shame and notoriety, its name no longer a jest but a mark of deep disgrace. Through all the turmoil, Abigail's cabin stood a silent witness on its small rise. The trials concluded. Thorne, his identity finally pinned down by the ring description, and Croft's terrified confession along with his key operatives. Brody, and Croft among them, received long sentences in federal prison redemption. Gap began the arduous, painful process of finding genuine redemption, a path paved with accountability and hard truths. Abigail lived out her remaining years in relative peace, a figure of quiet, moral authority. She never spoke of her pivotal role, unless asked directly by those few she trusted. The true heroes she always maintained were Waya and Nako, their resilience and courage. But those who knew the full story, few as they were, knew Abigail's steely courage had been the rock upon which injustice had broken. As the sun set over the high plains, painting the sky in hues of fire and peace, it seemed to whisper through the sage that one good person's courageous stand can indeed illuminate the path to justice, even in the darkest of places. One spring, years after the trials, long after Talon would have become a man, a riderless paint pony, but still proud, bearing the faint marks of Nako's distinctive paint, appeared at the edge of Abigail's property. Tied to its weathered saddle was a beautifully tanned deerskin, upon which was painted a single soaring hawk, its talons strong and sharp, its eyes fixed on a distant, hopeful horizon. A message of remembrance, of freedom, of a debt that transcended time and distance. Abigail hung it on her wall, beside Elias's rifle and the worn Bible. Later that day, as she swept the porch, her movements slow but deliberate, that she noticed it. A single vibrant purple wildflower, a desert bloom pushing its way defiantly through a tiny crack in the weathered planks, a testament to life's tenacity and the enduring bonds forged in shared adversity and unyielding courage. The familiar scent of crushed sage and sun-baked earth, once tinged with profound solitude, now carried a subtle, sweeter fragrance of lasting peace. And sometimes, when the wind swept down from the high ridges, carrying the scent of pine and distant snow melt, Abigail thought she could hear it, a faint, haunting melody, an Apache lullaby or a song of freedom, as if Waya, miles and worlds away, was singing to Talon, and perhaps a quiet thank you echoing across the vastness to her shikis.